The wind in Wyoming had teeth, and in the late autumn of 1881, it bit early and deep. It was a lonely wind that swept down from the bony shoulders of the Bighorn Mountains, carrying the first promises of a hard winter. It found little to stop it across the stark plains, save for the cluster of weary, wood-framed buildings that clung to the earth like beggars and called themselves the town of Redemption Gap. And at the very edge of that town, where the prairie grass gave way to dust and defiance, it howled a little louder around the small, solitary cabin of the widow Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor knew the sound of that wind intimately. It was the only voice that spoke to her most days. For 2 years, since her husband, Jedediah, had met his end under the frantic hooves of a spooked stallion, the town had wrapped itself in a silence far colder than any winter gust. It was a silence thick with suspicion, a quiet condemnation that followed her like a shadow. Jedediah had been a hard man, quick with his fists and slow with his coin, but he had been one of them. Eleanor, with her quiet ways and Eastern-bred reticence, was not. The whispers had started before Jedediah's body was cold, that the cinch on his saddle had been tampered with, that Eleanor had a touch with horses that was unnatural, that her grief was too contained, too dignified. In a town where sorrow was a public spectacle, her private mourning was seen as proof of a cold heart, and a cold heart, they reasoned, was capable of anything. So they left her alone, ostracized on her patch of land, a ghost in her own life. Redemption Gap was a town running on fumes. The last silver vein had petered out a decade prior, leaving behind a population of stubborn souls too poor or too proud to leave. They were bound by a shared poverty and a rigid, unwritten code of honor that was as unforgiving as the land itself. This year, the early cold was a harbinger of true hardship. The ground had frozen solid before the last of the harvest could be brought in, and the gaunt faces of the townspeople reflected a gnawing anxiety. Winter was no longer a season. It was a predator. It was into this bleak landscape that Silas Kane rode, a specter from a different kind of past. He'd been gone 2 years, a lifetime in a place like Redemption Gap. He returned not with fanfare, but with the quiet weight of a man who has seen too much. He sat taller in the saddle, his shoulders broader, but there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A thin, white scar cut a clean line from the corner of his left eye down his cheek, a permanent reminder of a conflict he never spoke of. Before he'd left, Silas had been known for his easy smile and a restless charm that had left a string of broken hearts and angry fathers in his wake. The stories that followed him now were darker, whispers of card games won with a sharp eye and a quicker gun, of a life lived on the fringes of the law. The town remembered him as a heartbreaker. Rumor now painted him as something more dangerous. He had come back not for redemption, but simply because it was the only place left that felt remotely like home. Their paths crossed at the epicenter of the town's latest misfortune. The general store's warehouse, the town's primary larder against the coming winter, had gone up in flames 2 nights before. A stray spark, a forgotten lantern. No one was sure. The result was the same: a smoldering ruin and a cache of smoked hams, sacks of flour, and barrels of salted fish turned to ash and despair. The church, in a rare act of organized charity, had become an emergency distribution point for what little could be salvaged or donated from private stocks. Eleanor was there, standing at the back of the line, a gray wool shawl pulled tight around her head and shoulders, making her anonymous, another shadow among many. She kept her eyes fixed on the worn toes of her boots, feeling the familiar weight of averted gazes from the women in front of her. She was there out of necessity, her own supplies meager, her pride a luxury she could no longer afford. When Silas saw her, it was like a jolt of memory. He remembered the Eleanor from before she was the widow Hayes. He remembered a younger woman with a shy smile and eyes the color of a summer sky, a woman whose quiet presence had been a stark contrast to the town's rough-hewn coarseness. The woman in the line was whittled down, her posture rigid with a defensive grace, her face pale and drawn. He saw the whispers of the town made flesh in the slump of her shoulders. He moved through the crowd with an unconscious confidence that parted the townsfolk before him. He reached the distribution table, took his ration of beans and hardtack, and turned. He stopped directly in her path, blocking her way. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, raspy like dry earth. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes, no longer the color of summer but of a winter sky just before a storm, widened for a fraction of a second. She saw the scar first, then the man. "Mr. Kane," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, tight and unused. She gave a curt nod and tried to step around him. He didn't move. "It's been a while." 2 years, she stated, her tone flat, offering no encouragement. An awkward silence hung between them, a pocket of stillness in the shuffling misery of the church hall. He wanted to say something, that he was sorry for her loss, that the town was treating her poorly, but the words felt hollow and intrusive. The Silas of old would have offered a charming smile and a glib remark. This Silas simply nodded. "Ma'am." He stepped aside, and she moved past him without another glance. A ghost slipping back into the shadows. That might have been the end of it. Another fleeting, uncomfortable moment in a town full of them. But the wind, which had been worrying at the church's rafters all morning, began to shriek. The sky, a dull pewter gray, darkened to the color of a bruise. Snow began to fall. Not the gentle, picturesque flakes of a Christmas card, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a furious gale. A blizzard descended upon Redemption Gap with the suddenness of an ambush. Within an hour, the world beyond the window panes was a churning vortex of white. The town disappeared. Roads became indistinguishable from fields. Silas, who had intended to ride out that afternoon, found himself marooned. His first thought was the boarding house, the only place in town that rented rooms. But as he fought his way through the blinding snow, a panicked cry reached him. A crowd was gathered near the smoldering remains of the warehouse. The wind had fanned the embers, and a stray tongue of flame had leaped to the adjacent building, the old, tinder-dry boarding house. It was now fully engulfed, a roaring pyre against the white fury of the storm. There was nowhere to go. The church was overflowing with families who lived too far out of town to make it home. Every spare bed, every patch of floor, was claimed. Silas stood in the gale, the heat of the fire on one side of his face, the biting cold on the other. A man utterly and completely stranded. And then, he thought of the lone cabin at the edge of town. It took him nearly half an hour to cross a distance that would normally take 5 minutes. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and blinding him. He found Eleanor's cabin more by memory than by sight. A faint yellow smudge of lamplight in the maelstrom. He pounded on the door, his knuckles numb. When it opened, she stood framed in the warm light, her face etched with alarm. She saw him, coated in snow, a frozen apparition on her doorstep, and her expression hardened into a mask of wary disbelief. "The boarding house is gone," he shouted over the howl of the storm. "Burned down. There's no other place." Eleanor stared at him, her hand gripping the edge of the door. Every instinct screamed at her to shut it, to preserve the sanctity of her small, lonely world, to let this man in, a man with his own cloud of rumors hanging over him, was to invite the very judgment she had fought so hard to endure in silence. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But to turn him away, into a storm that could kill a man in minutes, was a cruelty she did not possess. The battle in her eyes lasted only a moment, but Silas saw it plain as day. "I'll sleep on the floor, by the fire. I'll be gone as soon as it breaks," he pressed, his teeth chattering. She finally gave a stiff, reluctant nod. She stepped back, opening the door just wide enough for him to enter, and then shut it fast against the storm. The roar of the wind was cut off, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. The cabin was small, sparse, and impeccably clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a meager fire crackling within. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall, and a small kitchen area was tucked into a corner. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and drying herbs, and something else, the faint, cloying smell of loneliness. "Thank you," Silas said, his voice sounding overloud in the quiet. He began to shrug off his snow-caked coat. "It is temporary," Eleanor said, her back to him as she fussed with a log in the fire. She did not say, "You're welcome." The words were a clear boundary, a line drawn in the sand. "There's a hook by the door." The hours that followed were a study in strained silence. They moved around the small space with the cautious, deliberate movements of 2 predators sharing a cage. He took a seat at the table. She remained standing by the hearth. The conversation, when it came, was clipped and practical, consisting of single-word questions and monosyllabic answers about the storm, the fire, the dwindling woodpile. They avoided each other's eyes, their gazes skittering off to the fire, the windows, the floor, anywhere but at each other. The space between them felt charged, heavy with the unspoken histories they both carried. Later, as Eleanor prepared a simple stew of potatoes and salted pork, Silas felt a restless energy. He stood up, pacing the small confines of the room. His gaze fell upon a small, makeshift mantelpiece above the fireplace. On it sat a single, stark object, a tarnished silver tintype in a plain wooden frame. He stepped closer. It was a portrait of a man with a severe face, a thick mustache, and eyes that seemed to hold a permanent scowl. Jedediah Hayes. It was less a memorial to a loved one and more a piece of evidence, a constant reminder of her status as his widow. His eyes drifted downward. Beside the hearth was a small wooden chest that served as storage. The lid was closed, but one of its drawers was slightly ajar, snagged on something within. It was an insignificant detail, a minor bit of household untidiness, but in the oppressive quiet, it drew his eye. Acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, a need to simply do something. He knelt down and pushed the drawer closed. It wouldn't budge. He pulled it open slightly to clear the obstruction, and his eyes fell on the contents. Inside, nestled amongst some old linens, was a folded piece of foolscap paper. It was worn, the creases soft, as if it had been opened and refolded many times. The handwriting was a jagged, angry scrawl. It wasn't a formal document, but a letter, addressed to the town sheriff. Silas knew he shouldn't read it. It was a violation of the fragile truce that existed between them, but he couldn't stop himself. His eyes scanned the lines, the words leaping out at him like accusations. Always said she was too cold for a woman. Saw her with that stallion the day before, whispering to it like a witch. Jed was a strong man. It ain't right how he went. The cinch rope was frayed just so, not a clean break. I tell you, Sheriff, you need to look at the wife. A woman like that is capable of anything to get her freedom. It was signed by one of the town's most notorious gossips. It was the voice of the town, its suspicion given form and venom. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He gently pushed the letter back into its place and slid the drawer shut, the soft scrape of wood on wood sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. He stood up and turned. Eleanor was at the table, placing 2 bowls of stew down. She hadn't seen him, but when he met her gaze across the small cabin, he was no longer looking at a withdrawn and wary widow. He was looking at a woman who lived every day in a prison built of whispers, a woman who slept in the same room as the ghost of her husband and the written proof of her town's hatred. The storm outside had a voice, a wild and angry howl, but as he sat down at the table, Silas knew the silence in the cabin was infinitely louder. The blizzard did not break with the dawn. Instead, it settled in for a long siege, erasing the world and shrinking their universe to the 4 log walls of the cabin. The first morning was the hardest. Silas awoke on the floor near the hearth to the smell of wood smoke and the sight of Eleanor, already dressed, moving with a spectral quietness in the gray morning light. She added a log to the fire, her movements precise and economical, her entire being a study in contained energy. She did not acknowledge him. For Silas, a man accustomed to the easy camaraderie of bunkhouses and the fleeting intimacy of strangers, the silence was a physical weight. He felt like a clumsy giant in her small, ordered world. He rolled up the blanket she had given him, placing it neatly on the chair she had indicated was his. "Morning," he offered, his voice a rough intrusion. "The coffee is on," she replied, without turning from the small stove. The days bled into one another, each marked by the same suffocating tension. A brittle routine formed between them, an unspoken treaty of shared space. Eleanor would rise before the sun, her quiet efficiency a wall around her. She cooked meals of beans, biscuits, and salted meat, placing his plate on the table without a word, then eating her own portion while standing by the fire, her back to him. She moved through the chores of her solitary life, mending, cleaning, checking her scant preserves, as if he wasn't there. Her silence was not empty. It was a living thing, a palpable presence in the room, and it spoke of a deep and abiding distrust. Silas tried to fill it. He offered a forced smile when she handed him a cup of coffee. He made observations about the unabating storm, comments that were met with a single nod or a noncommittal hum. He felt the fool, his legendary charm useless against the granite of her reserve, the reputation that preceded him, that of a man who could talk his way into any woman's affections, died a quiet death in the face of her profound indifference. By the third day, the inactivity was gnawing at him worse than the cold. He was not a man built for sitting still. He needed to do something, to feel the strain of muscle and the satisfaction of a task completed. He pulled on his coat and boots, the scraping of his chair loud enough to make Eleanor flinch. "The woodpile must be buried," he said, more to the room than to her. "I'll clear a path and bring some in." She finally looked at him then, a flicker of surprise in her winter sky eyes. She gave a short, sharp nod and pointed to a corner near the door. "The axe is there." The work was a release. He plunged into the waist-deep snow, the wind a physical blow against his face, and located the woodpile beneath its white shroud. For hours, he worked in a steady rhythm, the sharp bite of the axe into frozen pine a satisfying counterpoint to the howl of the wind. He cleared a path, then split the logs, his breath pluming in the frigid air. When he returned, stomping the snow from his boots, his arms laden with firewood, he found a tin cup of steaming coffee waiting on the edge of the hearth. It was the first gesture she had made that wasn't born of pure necessity, a silent acknowledgement of his labor. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of ice between them. The next day, he pointed out a section of the roof where the relentless wind had worked a few shingles loose. "That'll let the damp in, rot the wood," he said. She provided a hammer and a handful of nails without question. While the storm raged, he worked inside, securing loose floorboards that groaned under his weight. He was useful, and in that utility, they found a new, safer language. They began to talk, not of themselves, but of the work, of the best way to brace a door against the wind, of how to tell if wood was properly seasoned. One evening, as the blizzard finally began to exhaust itself, the wind softening from a shriek to a mournful moan, they sat by the fire. The silence that fell was different now, less tense, more contemplative. It was Silas who broke it. He stared into the flames, his face cast in flickering shadow, the scar on his cheek a pale slash in the firelight. "I spent a winter snowed in like this once before," he said, his voice low. "In the Rockies. Was running from a sheriff in Colorado over a card game that went sour." Eleanor, who was darning a sock with meticulous stitches, did not look up, but her hand stilled. She was listening. Encouraged, he continued. He spoke of his 2 years adrift, not as a grand adventure, but as a series of disjointed and lonely pictures. He told her of the dust-choked plains of Texas, the humid, perfumed air of a New Orleans boarding house, the hard, unforgiving faces of miners in the Dakota territories. He spoke of his mistakes, glossing over the details but not the sentiment. And he spoke of the women. He didn't name them, didn't boast. He spoke of them with a strange mixture of fondness and regret. A saloon girl with a laugh like cracked bells, a rancher's daughter who believed his empty promises, a woman in St. Louis who had deserved better than a goodbye note left on a pillow. He painted a picture of himself as a man who was always moving toward the next horizon, leaving a trail of loose ends and quiet sorrows in his wake. He wasn't sure why he was telling her this. Perhaps it was a confession, an attempt to lay the truth of his own flawed character bare to counter the town's rumors. Or perhaps, in this small, isolated cabin, he felt safe enough to admit he was tired of being the man in his own stories. When he finally fell silent, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. He expected judgment, or at the very least, a cool disinterest. He waited for her to retreat back into her fortress of silence. Instead, after a long moment, Eleanor set aside her mending and looked at him, her gaze direct and unnervingly clear. "Do you regret it?" she asked. The question was so simple, so devoid of accusation, that it caught him off guard. She wasn't asking if he was sorry for the hearts he'd broken or the trouble he'd caused. She was asking something deeper, about the weight of his own life. He thought for a long time. "I regret the leaving," he said at last, the words tasting unfamiliar and true. "Seems all I'm good at is the leaving." A look passed over her face, something akin to understanding, and then it was gone. She picked up her sewing again, and the conversation was over. But the air in the room had changed. He had offered a piece of his truth, and she had not thrown it back at him. That night, the cold was a physical beast. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted snow under a sky brilliant with stars. But the temperature had plummeted. The cabin, with its drafty walls, offered little protection. The fire in the hearth, their only source of heat, dwindled to a bed of glowing, hungry embers. The cold seeped through the floorboards, a tangible, creeping presence. "We'll have to sleep by the fire," Eleanor stated, her voice matter-of-fact. It was not a suggestion. Silas nodded, understanding the grim necessity. She laid her own thin bedroll on one side of the hearth, while he took his single blanket on the other. They lay down in the dying firelight, separated by a few feet of floor but enclosed in a bubble of shared vulnerability. Sleep did not come easily. The cold was a constant, gnawing thing, and the silence was charged with a new and unfamiliar intimacy. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, Silas awoke. It wasn't a sound that had woken him, but the sheer intensity of the cold. His bones ached with it. The fire was little more than a handful of winking red eyes in the dark. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then he saw her. She was not lying down. She was sitting up, curled into the tightest possible ball, her arms wrapped around her legs, her head bowed. Her whole body was trembling, racked by violent, uncontrollable shivers. In the faint starlight filtering through the single window, he could see she was not just cold. She was suffering. The sight broke through his own discomfort. The formidable, self-sufficient widow was gone. In her place was a small, shivering woman trying to endure the night. He moved without thinking. He took his own wool blanket, thicker and warmer than hers, and crawled the short distance to her side. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. As he pulled it snug around her, the back of his hand brushed against her spine. Her whole body went rigid. The shivering stopped as if he had thrown a switch. It was the slightest of touches, skin against worn fabric, but in the starved and silent space between them, it was an explosion. It was the first time they had made physical contact, and the air crackled with the significance of it. He expected her to pull away, to lash out with a sharp word. He started to withdraw his hand, but she didn't move. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then, her voice came out of the darkness, a raw, fragile whisper, so close he could feel the ghost of her breath. "Don't be so quick to believe what you see or hear of me, Mr. Kane." It was not an admonishment. It was a plea, a warning, and it was the first crack in the fortress, a direct reference to the invisible wall of rumor and suspicion that surrounded her. He heard the letter he'd read in her words, the years of silent accusation. He retreated to his side of the hearth, the warmth of his own blanket now gone, but he no longer felt the cold. A different kind of fire had been lit inside him. He lay awake for the rest of the night, staring into the darkness, her whispered words echoing in his mind. He was confused. He was intrigued. The town saw a black widow. He had seen a survivor. But in that moment of shivering vulnerability, he had glimpsed the woman trapped beneath it all. He thought of her eyes, not cold as he'd first assumed, but exhausted, weary from a battle no one else could see. And Silas Kane, a man who had spent his life running from complications, felt a powerful, unsettling urge to stay. The blizzard broke on the 5th day, leaving behind a world transformed. The sky was a sharp, aching blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it hurt the eyes. Redemption Gap, buried under a thick blanket of white, looked clean, almost peaceful, but Silas knew it was a lie. A clean coat of snow couldn't wash away the town's deep-seated ugliness. Necessity forced them out of their sanctuary. Their supplies, already strained, were critically low. The trip into town was a silent, tense affair. The path they trod was the only scar on the pristine landscape, a dark line leading from her isolated cabin back to the heart of her misery. The moment they stepped onto the main street, the whispers began. They were as soft and insidious as the drift of fine snow from a roofline. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased mid-sentence. Faces appeared in windows. Curtains were pulled back, and the town's collective gaze fell upon them. It was a tangible thing, a weight of judgment that pressed on the air. Silas, who had always walked through this town with an easy swagger, felt the unfamiliar sting of being an accomplice. By sheltering with the outcast, he had become one himself. Their destination was the general store, a cramped space that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and damp wool. As they entered, the half-dozen patrons within fell silent. The storekeeper, a man with a perpetually sour face, stopped weighing a sack of flour and stared. Eleanor seemed not to notice. She moved with her usual quiet purpose, her eyes fixed on the list she had mentally prepared. But Silas saw the slight tightening of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders just a little too straight. It was the posture of a soldier marching into enemy territory. He stood by the door, a silent sentinel, his presence a clear and deliberate statement. He watched as Eleanor gathered her meager provisions, flour, salt, a small portion of bacon. She moved to the counter to pay, and that was when Martha Miller, a woman whose piety was as sharp and unyielding as her bony elbows, stepped forward. Martha had been the one who had led the chorus of whispers after Jedediah's death. "Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. She held out a small, folded piece of cloth. It was a man's kerchief, made of worn, faded blue cotton, the kind a man might use to wipe the sweat from his brow after a long day's work. "I found this while cleaning out some of Jedediah's old effects from the livery. I thought you might want it." Eleanor looked at the object in Martha's hand as if it were a coiled snake. She did not reach for it. Martha's smile tightened, turning cruel. She pushed the kerchief into Eleanor's basket, her knuckles brushing against the sack of flour. "To remember your sins," she hissed, her voice low enough for only those at the counter to hear. Something inside Silas snapped. The casual, venomous cruelty of it ignited a white-hot rage in his gut. He took a step forward, his voice a low growl. "You ought to keep your mouth shut, Martha." The store went deathly quiet. Martha's eyes widened, a flicker of fear mixed with righteous indignation. "Well, I never. It seems the widow has found herself a protector. I wonder what Jedediah would think of that." "Leave his name out of it," Silas snarled. He took another step, his hand instinctively dropping to his side. The movement was pure menace, a promise of violence that he was more than capable of delivering. But before he could say more, a hand was on his arm. It was Eleanor's. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into his forearm. He looked down at her. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were pleading. "Don't," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Please, don't make me guiltier." Her words cut through his anger like a shard of ice. He looked around at the eager, hate-filled faces watching them, and he finally understood. His defense of her was not a kindness. In their eyes, it was proof that she had seduced him, that they were bound in some kind of illicit union, that her sin was now their shared secret. To them, his anger was not righteous. It was the fury of a co-conspirator. He had nearly played right into their hands. He let out a slow, deliberate breath, the anger receding, replaced by a cold, bitter clarity. He gave Martha one last look of pure contempt, then turned, took the basket from Eleanor's hand, and walked out of the store. She followed him into the blinding sunlight. The walk back to the cabin was steeped in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the strained quiet of strangers, but the heavy silence of a shared ordeal. The ugliness of the encounter hung in the air between them. Back in the cabin, he set the basket on the table with more force than necessary. "You shouldn't let them talk to you that way," he said, his voice tight with the remnants of his anger. "And what would you have me do?" she replied, her voice weary. "Have you fight my battles for me? All that would do is give them more stones to throw. They would say I've bewitched you." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the full depth of her exhaustion. "Your outrage is a luxury. Mr. Kane, my silence is a shield." He had no answer to that. He watched her as she began to unpack the groceries, her movement steady and sure. And in that moment, he began to see her with new eyes. He saw past the quiet, withdrawn widow to the woman beneath. He saw a strength he had never before witnessed, a resilience that was as profound as it was silent. It wasn't the brittle beauty of the women he had known, who wilted it under the slightest hardship. This was a different kind of beauty, something hard and elemental, like a tree that has grown twisted but strong against a relentless wind. He saw the grace in her endurance, the dignity in her solitude. The incident seemed to shift something between them. In the days that followed, a quiet partnership began to form. They worked together to clear the last of the snow from her roof and yard. One afternoon, driven by a need to impose order on some small corner of her world, Eleanor decided to thoroughly clean the small, neglected pantry. It was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with old jars and the ghosts of past winters. As Silas helped her move a heavy, worm-eaten cupboard away from the wall, he noticed a section of the floorboards was loose. Curiosity piqued. He pried it up with the tip of his knife. Beneath it, lying in the shallow space between the floor and the cold earth, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. He pulled it out. It was heavy for its size. He looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She shook her head slightly, her expression as mystified as his. He unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, its cover warped by damp, a personal journal. Embossed on the cover, barely legible, were the initials J.H. Jedediah Hayes. A thick silence fell over the small pantry. Eleanor stared at the journal as if it were a relic from a tomb. Silas opened it. The pages were filled with a cramped, aggressive script. He began to read aloud, his voice low. The entries were not the musings of a simple rancher. They were dark, paranoid, and cruel. Jedediah wrote of his mounting gambling debts to men in Cheyenne. He wrote with contempt about the townspeople, calling them fools and weaklings. He wrote of his wife, Eleanor, with a possessive, chilling detachment, complaining of her Eastern airs and her stubborn silence. Then came the darker entries. He documented an affair with a woman in a neighboring town, describing her with a crude, dismissive lust. He wrote of a fight, of hitting her, and of the satisfaction it brought him. The final few entries were about a horse, the very stallion that had killed him. It wasn't his horse. He had won it in a crooked card game, and the previous owner had warned him the animal was wild. A devil. Jedediah had written, "I will break him, or he will break me. A man is master of his own stock." Silas closed the book, the leather feeling unclean in his hands. He looked at Eleanor. Her face was a mask of stone, but her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. This changes everything. This proves it. It proves what kind of man he was. You could have taken this to the sheriff. It would have cleared your name." She took a long, shaky breath and finally met his gaze. There was no relief in her eyes, only a profound and ancient sorrow. She reached out and placed a hand on the journal, her fingers tracing her husband's initials. "Choose slowly. Silas," she whispered, using his first name for the first time. The sound of it on her lips was both intimate and startling. "Because the truth can kill, too." "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising with incredulous frustration. "The truth would have set you free." "Free to be what?" she asked, her voice gaining a steely edge. "To be the town's object of pity instead of its object of scorn. To have them whisper about the poor, beaten wife instead of the cold-hearted widow. It's just a different cage. Silas, the truth wouldn't have given me peace. It would have just given them a new story to tell about me. A dead man can't defend himself, and in a town like this, speaking ill of the dead is a worse sin than murder." She had chosen to endure their suspicion rather than expose her husband's depravity and invite their pity. She had chosen to bear the weight of their lies to protect the last, shattered remnants of her own privacy. He looked at her, and the magnitude of her silent sacrifice struck him with the force of a physical blow. Later that evening, the sun began its slow descent, setting the snow-covered plains on fire. The western sky bled into spectacular shades of orange, rose, and deep violet. Eleanor was on the small porch, kneeling before a small brazier, coaxing a few stubborn coals to life to ward off the evening chill. The golden light of the setting sun caught in her hair, which had come loose from its tight bun, and turned the stray strands to threads of fire. Her face, illuminated by the warm glow from the coals and the majestic light of the heavens, was etched with a quiet, focused beauty. Silas stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the gentle movement of her hands as she fanned the embers, the simple, unadorned grace of her posture. He was no longer seeing the widow, the suspect, or the survivor. He was seeing Eleanor, just Eleanor, and the sight filled him with a feeling so powerful, so raw, it almost brought him to his knees. That night, sleep was an impossibility. He lay on his bedroll, staring into the darkness of the cabin, but all he could see was her face in the sunset, the feelings that had been stirring within him, curiosity, admiration, a protective instinct, coalesced into something new, something overwhelming and terrifying in its intensity. It was a deep, aching tenderness that was entirely foreign to him. He had known desire, the quick, hot flash of passion that burned out as quickly as it was lit. This was different. This was a slow burn, a fire that had taken root deep in his soul, and Silas Kane, the man who was good at nothing but leaving, was terrified by the undeniable truth that he did not want to leave at all. The cold returned that week with a personal vengeance. The brief respite of sun and calm had been a cruel trick, a false spring in the heart of winter. Now, a different kind of cold descended, a still, silent, penetrating cold that came not with wind and snow, but with a clear, star-dusted sky that seemed to suck the very warmth from the earth. The logs Silas had chopped were green and spat more than they burned. The fire in the hearth was a sullen, struggling thing, offering little comfort against the cold that seeped through the chinking in the log walls and radiated up from the frozen ground beneath the floorboards. By nightfall, the cabin was an icebox. Every breath hung in the air as a visible cloud. Eleanor, wrapped in every shawl she owned, and Silas, wearing his coat and hat indoors, huddled near the pathetic fire, the space between them filled with the shared misery of the cold. Sleep in their separate, drafty spots was not just unappealing, it was dangerous. It was Eleanor who acknowledged the truth first, her voice a tight, pragmatic whisper that was nearly lost in the chatter of her own teeth. "It's not safe. The fire won't last the night." Silas looked at her. In the dim, flickering light, her face was pinched and blue-lipped. He felt the same deep, unshakable chill in his own bones. He knew what she was implying, the only logical, terrifying solution. "We'll have to share," he said, the words feeling enormous and heavy in the frigid air. He gestured with his chin toward the floor in front of the hearth. "All the blankets. It's the only way." She nodded, a single, sharp dip of her chin. There was no coyness, no hesitation, only the grim acceptance of a survivor. The unspoken intimacy of the act was a live current between them, but it was secondary to the primal need for warmth. They arranged their meager bedding with a clumsy, awkward formality. Her thin bedroll was laid down first, then his own single blanket, and finally, the heavy wool blanket he had draped over her that one night was spread over the top, their shared covering. They lay down side by side, backs to the dying fire, facing each other in the near-total darkness. The space between them was a chasm of cold air and unspoken tension. They were careful not to touch, their bodies rigid, each occupying their own sliver of territory beneath the blanket. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hiss of the embers and the lonely, far-off howl of a coyote, a sound that underscored their profound isolation. Lying there, inches apart in the dark, every small sound was magnified, the rustle of the wool, the soft puff of their condensed breath. Silas could feel the heat radiating from her body, a tantalizing promise just beyond his reach. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the soft rhythm of her breathing, of the woman who was both a complete stranger and the most intimate companion he had known in years. The tension was unbearable. It was more than just the proximity of a man and a woman. It was the weight of their shared confinement, of the town's hatred, of Jedediah's journal, of all the words they had not said. Silas knew that if he did not break the silence, it would break him. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out a hand across the narrow space between them. He did not try to grasp her hand, but simply laid his own on the rough blanket beside it, his little finger brushing against hers. It was a question, an offering. For a long moment, she did not react. He felt his heart hammer against his ribs, certain she would pull away, retreating back into the safety of her icy reserve. He was about to withdraw his hand, to retreat from his own foolish bravery, when he felt the slightest of movements. She did not pull her hand away. She simply allowed it to remain, her stillness a form of acceptance, a quiet consent that was more powerful than any word. Emboldened, he gently let his hand cover hers. Her fingers were ice cold, but they did not recoil from his touch. "I have never been so lonely as when I was in a crowded room," he whispered into the darkness, the confession torn from a place deep inside him. Always talking, always smiling, but it was all a show. A man can be surrounded by people and still be 1,000 miles away from anyone. He felt a faint pressure from her hand in his, an answer. "I used to dream of being touched," her voice came back, a fragile thread of sound, so quiet he had to strain to hear it. Not in the way Jedediah did, but just a hand on my arm, someone to sit beside me in the evening without wanting anything, to be seen and to be believed." Her words were a window into the desolate landscape of her heart. They spoke of a thirst so profound he could almost feel it himself. They lay there, hands clasped in the darkness, and whispered the truths that the daylight kept hidden. They spoke of fear, his fear of settling down, of being known and found wanting, her fear of trusting, of being hurt again, of the cage of her own past. They spoke of desires so simple they were heartbreaking, the wish for a quiet morning with easy conversation, the longing for a shared look of understanding across a room, the ache to simply be held by someone who meant them no harm. It was a litany of brokenness, a shared confession of two souls who had learned to survive but had forgotten how to live. He felt her shiver, a tremor that ran through her whole body. It was not from the cold. "Choose slowly, Silas," she whispered. The words from the pantry resurrected in the darkness. It was her mantra, her shield. But this time, it sounded different. It was not a warning to him. It was a plea to herself, a reminder of the danger of this moment, of the perilous warmth spreading from his hand through her entire body. It was a test. Silas felt the weight of her words, the years of pain and betrayal they contained. The old Silas, the charming wanderer, would have offered an easy promise, a smooth reassurance he had no intention of keeping. But that man was gone, buried somewhere out on the prairie. He tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. His heart was a wild, frantic thing in his chest. "What if I'm tired of choosing slowly?" he whispered back, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "What if choosing slowly is just another way of being lonely? What if, for once in my life, I don't want to choose at all? What if I just want to touch the truth?" He shifted, turning onto his side to face her more fully. He could just make out the pale oval of her face in the gloom, the dark pools of her eyes. He saw his own desperate longing reflected there. He brought his other hand up, his fingers trembling as he gently cupped her cheek. Her skin was cold, but beneath it, he felt a tremor of life. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. But it was enough. It was everything. He leaned in, his movements unsteady, hesitant. It was not a kiss of conquest or of practiced seduction. It was a collision. Their lips met in a clumsy, desperate search, a question and an answer all at once. It was a kiss choked with unshed tears and years of pent-up sorrow. It was hungry, not with lust, but with a profound, soul-deep starvation for simple human connection. It was the taste of salt and wood smoke and the cold, clean air of the cabin. It was a kiss that spoke of all the words they had whispered and all the pain they had never dared to voice. He pulled back slightly, their foreheads resting against each other, their breath mingling in the cold. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart. Or maybe it was his own. "Eleanor." He breathed her name like a prayer. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him back to her. And this time, the kiss was deeper, surer. It was a melting, a surrender. The hard, defensive lines of their bodies softened. The rigid control they both maintained so fiercely dissolved in the face of a shared, overwhelming need. They clung to each other. Two shipwrecked souls who had finally found a piece of driftwood in a vast, cold ocean. Later, as they lay tangled together under the single blanket, the last of the embers in the hearth finally winking out, he felt a tremor of fear for the morning. This fragile, beautiful thing they had found in the darkness might not survive the harsh light of day. He held her tighter, pressing his face into her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her temple. "For whatever tomorrow looks like, if you can't look at me in the morning, I'll understand." She didn't answer with words. She simply squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the precipice on which they now stood. That night, beneath the rough wool of an old blanket, something broke and something was born. The ice that had encased two broken hearts for years finally began to crack and melt. not in a blaze of passion, but in the desperate, shared warmth of two people who had forgotten what warmth felt like. It was intense, it was sensual, and it was as fragile as a pane of frost on a winter window. The morning arrived, not with a gentle dawn, but with a harsh, gray light that felt like an accusation. The warmth they had created in the darkness, a fragile pocket of life against the cold, vanished, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more complicated than any that had come before. They moved around the small cabin with the stilted, cautious grace of strangers who had shared a profound and possibly regrettable intimacy. Silas rose first, rekindling the fire with a focus that was entirely feigned, his mind replaying the feel of her in his arms, the sound of her whispered confessions. He was intensely aware of her when she finally stirred, of the rustle of the blankets, of the way she sat up and pulled her shawl tightly around herself, a familiar armor being reassumed. He made coffee, and they drank it standing in their separate corners of the room, the space between them charged with unspoken questions. The easy language of survival and work they had forged was gone, and they had not yet found the words to replace it. It was Eleanor who broke the stillness. She finished her coffee, rinsed the tin cup with methodical precision, and pulled on her worn coat and boots. "I'm going out," she said, her eyes fixed on the door latch, refusing to meet his. "Where?" The question was out before he could stop it. It sounded possessive, demanding, and he instantly regretted it. "To the cemetery," she replied, her voice flat. She offered no other explanation. Without another look, she opened the door and slipped out, closing it softly behind her, leaving Silas alone in the quiet cabin with the ghost of the night they had shared. The walk to the town cemetery was a pilgrimage Eleanor made out of habit, not devotion. The snow was crisp under her boots, the air so cold it burned her lungs. She did not go to mourn Jedediah. She went to stand before the simple wooden cross that marked his grave because it was the one place on earth where she could confront the totality of her life in Redemption Gap. The grave was a monument to her imprisonment. She stood there, a solitary figure in the vast, white landscape, and did not weep. She thought not of her husband, but of the man she had left behind in her cabin, a man who had looked at her not with pity or scorn, but with a raw, searching honesty that had breached defenses she hadn't known she still possessed. The memory of his touch, of the desperate, gentle kiss in the dark, was a fire in the pit of her stomach. It was hope, a feeling so foreign and so dangerous that it terrified her. Hope was a precursor to pain. She knew this. She had learned it well. She stayed until the cold seeped through her boots and numbed her feet, then turned her back on the grave and walked away. While she was gone, Silas was a man possessed by a new and unfamiliar purpose. Her whispered words, "to be believed," had become his creed. He would not, could not, be another person who failed her. He pulled on his coat and strode into town, not as a drifter seeking shelter, but as an inquisitor seeking truth. His first stop was the church, where he found Reverend Michael tending to the frozen pipes in the vestry. The preacher was a man whose faith was sincere, but whose courage was lacking. "Reverend," Silas began, his tone respectful but firm, "I need to ask you about Jedediah Hayes." The Reverend's face clouded over. "A tragedy, his passing, a pillar of our small community. A generous man. Generous with his coin. Maybe," Silas pressed, "what about with his spirit? Was he a good husband to Eleanor?" Reverend Michael shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Silas's direct gaze. "Marriage is a private covenant. Mr. Kane, Mrs. Hayes is a very reserved woman. She did not seek counsel. One might say she kept to herself, even when her husband was alive." "Or maybe she was kept to herself," Silas countered. The preacher offered only platitudes and evasions, a perfect reflection of the town's willful blindness. Silas left him, the scent of pious hypocrisy clinging to the air. His next stop was the saloon. It was early. and the place was empty save for the woman who ran it. Belle was a formidable woman in her 40s, with eyes that had seen every kind of human folly and a mouth that was not afraid to speak of it. She was polishing glasses behind the bar when Silas entered. "Buyin' or sellin'? Cane?" she asked without looking up. "Just asking," he said, leaning against the bar. "Jedediah Hayes. He used to come in here. I'd wager—" Belle let out a short, humorless laugh. "Like a fox to a henhouse. That man owed me more money than this town sees in a month. Had a temper like a cornered snake and a thirst to match. Always talking big about his land and his deals. But his eyes were always shifty." "What about women?" Silas asked, his voice low. Belle finally stopped polishing and met his gaze. He wasn't particular. Any woman who looked at him twice, he thought was an invitation. There was a girl from Cheyenne for a while. He tired of her. There were others. She paused, her expression turning serious. His wife, though, she never came in here. Not once. Saw her on the street sometimes. Looked like a ghost. He broke something in that woman long before he broke his own neck. "The horse," Silas said. "The one that killed him. You know anything about it?" "I know he won it in a crooked card game from a drifter named Calloway," she said instantly. "Calloway told him the beast was pure devil, untrainable. Jedediah just laughed, said he could break anything." The information settled in Silas's gut like a lead weight. He thanked Belle and left, his resolve hardening into cold fury. His last stop was a small cottage at the far end of town, where the former sheriff, Amos Blackwood, now lived in retirement. Amos was an old man, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his conscience heavy with the past. He was hesitant to talk at first, but Silas's quiet, intense demeanor wore him down. They sat in the old man's dusty parlor, and Silas laid out what he knew. Amos sighed, a long, rattling sound. "I never felt right about it," he confessed, his voice thin and reedy. "Jedediah was a town councilman. He donated the bell for the church. People looked up to him. When he died, it was easier to call it a tragic accident." "But you didn't believe it was," Silas stated. "The cinch on that saddle," Amos said, shaking his head. "It was frayed. Yeah, but it looked to me like it had been cut halfway through, meant to give way under strain, and the marks on Jedediah's body. Some of them were from the hooves. Sure, but others, they looked older, bruises on his arms, like a man gets when he's been in a fight and lost." He looked up at Silas, his old eyes filled with a weary shame. "I suspected Calloway, the man he won the horse from, might have done it, but Calloway had vanished, and Mrs. Hayes—" She said nothing, just stood there, silent. It was easier to close the book. The town wanted it closed. Silas now had the truth, or at least the jagged pieces of it. Jedediah was an abusive, philandering cheat who likely met his end at the hands of a man he had wronged, and Eleanor had been left to take the fall, to carry the weight of the town's suspicion in her silence. Armed with this poisonous knowledge, Silas made his way back to the cabin. His mind was racing. He would write to the district marshal in Cheyenne. He would demand they reopen the case. He would burn this town's hypocrisy to the ground if he had to. He found Eleanor at the table, her back to the door. She was staring at a piece of folded brown paper in her hands. As he stepped inside, she looked up, and he saw the fear in her eyes, stark and raw. "What is it?" he asked, his own anger momentarily forgotten. She slid the paper across the table. It was a note, the words crudely formed in charcoal. Asterisk, "Some things are better left buried. So are people. Leave town or you'll end up next to your husband." The threat was a physical blow. Someone in town knew the truth, or part of it, and was terrified of what Silas's presence might unearth. This wasn't just about whispers anymore. This was dangerous. "We're leaving," he said, his voice a low command. "Right now." "And go where?" "Silas?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. "This is my home. It's all I have. I will not be run out by a coward's threat." At that moment, the simmering rage in Silas boiled over. It was not just for the coward who wrote the note, but for the preacher, for Martha Miller, for old Amos, for the entire town. He grabbed his hat. "Stay here. Lock the door," he said, and before she could protest, he was gone. He strode directly to the general store, the heart of the town's gossip. He threw the door open and stood on the threshold, his eyes sweeping over the half-dozen men and women inside. "I have a message for the gutless snake who left a note at the Hayes cabin," he announced, his voice ringing with cold fury. Every sound in the store ceased. "Eleanor Hayes is staying, and so am I." He pointed a finger at the storekeeper, then moved it to encompass everyone in the room. "And I want you all to hear this. The next person who speaks a foul word to her, the next person who even looks at her sideways, will answer to me. If you want to run her out of this town, you'll have to run me out too, and I promise you, I won't go quietly." He let the threat hang in the air, his gaze daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. They stared back, their expressions a mixture of fear and shock. Satisfied, he turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He returned to the cabin to find Eleanor standing exactly where he had left her. Her face was pale, but there was a new light in her eyes, something he had never seen before. It was a flicker of awe. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice soft. "Someone had to," he replied. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and he saw the walls around her heart tremble. He saw the gratitude, the shock, the profound emotion of being defended for the first time in her life. But he also saw the fear. "I don't want you to carry this burden, Silas," she whispered, taking a small step back, reestablishing the distance between them. "This is my fight. It has been for 2 years. He saw it then, the terrible, tragic logic of her heart. This grand gesture, this public declaration of allegiance, was not a comfort to her. It was a weight. It was a chain that now bound him to her trouble, and her experience had taught her that all chains eventually chafe. The men in her life had always left. Her father had died. Her husband had betrayed her, and the town had abandoned her. Why should Silas be any different? Now, she had given him a reason, a burden too heavy for any man to carry for long. She was falling in love with him, the realization a terrifying bloom in the barren wasteland of her heart. And she was utterly, completely convinced that he would leave. It was only a matter of when. Silas's declaration in the general store did not douse the fire. It threw fat on it. His challenge had not cowed the town's silent aggressors. It had given their hatred a face and a name. For 2 days, an uneasy quiet settled over Redemption Gap, a silence that felt different from before. It was the coiled, watchful silence of a snake before it strikes. The strike came in the dead of the 3rd night. They were asleep, or trying to be, in their separate spots by the hearth when the first rock shattered the cabin's single window. The sound was an explosion of violence in the quiet dark, a spray of frigid air and glittering shards of glass across the floor. Eleanor let out a small, terrified cry and sat bolt upright. Before Silas was fully conscious, his instincts had taken over. "Stay down!" he roared, rolling to his feet and grabbing the heavy iron poker from the hearth. Another rock slammed against the log wall, followed by a third that thudded heavily against the door. A cacophony of drunken shouts rose from the darkness outside. Ugly, slurred words of hate aimed at the widow and her lover. Silas moved to the new gaping hole where the window had been, using the wall as cover to peer out. He could make out 3, maybe 4 shadowy figures, emboldened by whiskey and the anonymity of the night. They were fanning out, picking up more stones. "They're trying to flush us out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was a fool. He had thought a public threat would be enough. He hadn't counted on the depth of their venom. Another rock, larger this time, came hurtling through the window. It wasn't aimed at anything in particular, just a missile of pure malice. Silas, moving to block Eleanor's view and body with his own, didn't see it coming in the dark. It struck the wall beside him and ricocheted, catching him high on the side of the head with a sickening crack. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He staggered back, his ears ringing, a warm, wet stickiness suddenly flooding his left eye. He dropped the poker with a clatter and pressed a hand to his temple, his fingers coming away slick and dark. "Silas!" Eleanor's voice was a shriek of pure terror. Outside, the men, having thrown their stones and their courage, let out a final whoop and faded back into the darkness, their work done. The sudden silence they left behind was more terrifying than their noise. In the faint, dying light of the embers, Eleanor scrambled to his side. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice choked with panic. "It's nothing," he grunted, but the floor tilted beneath his feet, and he had to brace himself against the wall. She ignored his protests. Sit down, now!" Her voice had a new, sharp edge of command born of sheer terror. He obeyed, slumping into a chair at the table as she lit a lamp with trembling hands. The lamplight threw their frantic shadows against the wall. The wound was ugly, a deep, 3-inch gash just above his temple where the rock had grazed him. Blood matted his hair and streamed down his cheek, dripping onto the collar of his shirt. Eleanor's face was a mask of horrified determination. She tore a strip from a clean linen dish towel and fetched the small bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. Her hands shook so violently she could barely pour it onto the cloth. "This will sting," she warned, her voice unsteady. He barely flinched as she pressed the cloth to the wound, the fiery bite of the alcohol a distant sensation compared to the throbbing ache in his skull. She worked with a desperate focus, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She was so close he could smell the scent of wood smoke and faint, clean soap in her hair. He watched her, his one good eye tracing the lines of her face, the furrow of her brow, the way her lips were pressed into a thin, white line of concentration. She cleaned the blood away, her touch surprisingly gentle. As she worked, a single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek, then another. They fell onto the back of his hand, which rested on the table, hot and stinging. He looked down and saw that she was silently weeping, her shoulders shaking with the force of her suppressed sobs. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough, "it's just a cut." She shook her head, a violent, negative gesture. The tears came faster now, falling onto his shirt, dark spots on the worn fabric. "No," she choked out, the word torn from her. "It's not. It's because of me. They did this to you because of me." She finished cleaning the wound and began to bandage it with another strip of cloth, her movements clumsy through her tears. All the control, all the silent endurance she had cultivated for 2 long years, had finally shattered. The rock that had struck him had broken through her last defense. The terror of seeing him hurt, of realizing how easily he could have been killed protecting her, had undone her completely. She secured the bandage, her task finished, but she did not move away. Her hands rested on his shoulders, and she bowed her head, her body racked with sobs. "I'm so sorry, Silas, I'm so sorry." He reached up and covered her hand with his own. "There is nothing for you to be sorry for." "Yes, there is," she said, her voice a ragged whisper against his chest. She looked up at him then, her eyes swimming with a pain that was older and deeper than this single night. "I've been so afraid of letting anyone in, so afraid of the cost." She took a shuddering breath, her gaze locked on his. "I don't want to chew slowly anymore." The words, her old shield, now uttered as a surrender, hung in the air between them. It was the most profound declaration he had ever heard. It was a promise, a plea, and a choice, all in one. He pulled her gently into his arms, and she went without resistance, collapsing against him, her tears soaking his shoulder as he held her, his own head throbbing in time with the frantic beat of her heart. They did not sleep for the rest of the night. They sat by the fire, talking in low, urgent tones. The shattered window a constant reminder of the cage the town had become. By dawn, they had a plan. They left 2 hours later, riding Silas's horse. Eleanor seated behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. They told no one where they were going. They simply rode east, away from the rising sun and the town of Redemption Gap. Their destination was the railway junction at Fort Laramie, a 2-day ride. It was the closest place with a telegraph office and a federal marshal. The journey was a strange and dreamlike respite. The vast, silent world of snow and sky was a balm after the claustrophobic hatred of the town. They spoke little, but the silence was now a comfortable, shared thing. Her arms around him were a constant, reassuring presence. For the first time, they were not a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance, but a partnership, a single unit moving with a shared purpose. At Fort Laramie, Silas, his bandaged head drawing curious stares, officially filed a petition with the deputy marshal, citing new evidence and the escalating threats to Eleanor's life. He requested that Jedediah Hayes's death be formally reinvestigated. The deputy, a weary man who had seen it all, was skeptical but promised to telegraph the request to the district office in Cheyenne. There was nothing more they could do but wait. On the journey back, they rode at a slower pace, as if reluctant to return to the world that awaited them. As dusk began to settle on their first day out, they came across a wide, open meadow, a perfect bowl of untrodden snow under a sky of deepening purple. A profound stillness lay over the landscape. "Let's stop here," Eleanor said, her voice quiet in his ear. They made a small camp, building a fire that crackled cheerfully in the immense silence. After a simple meal of hardtack and jerky, they sat on a shared blanket, watching the first stars appear in the heavens. "I used to dream of having a garden," Eleanor said softly, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Just a small one, with climbing roses and herbs, a place where things would grow, instead of just endure." Silas looked at her, at the profile of her face illuminated by the firelight, and felt a familiar ache in his chest. An ache that was no longer just tenderness, but love. "I never let myself dream much," he admitted. "A drifter's dreams are just extra baggage. But I always figured, if I ever stopped drifting, I'd want a place where my horse had good pasture, a porch to watch the sunset from, and someone to watch it with." He turned to her, and she turned to him, and in the firelight, their shared simple dreams seemed not like fantasies, but like a map to a possible future. All the fear, all the hesitation, had been burned away in the violence of the attack. What was left was a raw and undeniable truth. He leaned in and kissed her, and this time there was no desperation, no sorrow. It was a kiss of deep and abiding tenderness, of trust that had been forged in fear and sealed in courage. It was the kiss of a man who had found his home and a woman who had found her hope. They came together that night under the vast, star-filled Wyoming sky, their bed a blanket on the snow, their only light the fire and the moon. It was not a frantic, desperate coupling like before. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a communion of two people who had seen the worst of each other's worlds and had chosen to build a new one together. It was a quiet, profound act of faith in the face of a faithless world. As they lay in each other's arms, wrapped together against the cold, Eleanor traced the line of his jaw with a gentle finger. "If this is a sin," she whispered, her voice filled with a fierce and wondrous conviction, "then I pray I live a sinner's life for all my days." They rode back into Redemption Gap the next afternoon. As they approached her cabin, they saw a rider waiting for them, a young man from the telegraph office at the fort. He handed Silas a folded telegram. Silas opened it, his heart pounding. He read the short, clipped message, then read it again. He looked at Eleanor, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "They're reopening the case," he said. "A marshal is coming from Cheyenne." Marshal Wallace Thompson arrived in Redemption Gap like a cold front. his presence lowering the temperature of the town by a noticeable 10 degrees. He was a tall, lean man with a face weathered into a permanent squint and a mustache that seemed to disapprove of everything it saw. He did not come with fanfare or a posse, just a single, weary-looking deputy, and an air of professional disinterest that was more intimidating than any overt threat. His investigation cleaved the town in two. The arrival of an outside authority forced the residents of Redemption Gap to finally choose a side. Whispers that had festered in the shadows were now dragged into the harsh light of day. Old alliances frayed. Neighbors who had shared coffee for 20 years now crossed the street to avoid each other. One faction, small but vocal, rallied quietly around Eleanor. It was led by Belle, the saloon owner, who spoke to the marshal with a blunt honesty that was as refreshing as it was rare. She told him of Jedediah's debts, his temper, his wandering eye. Others, emboldened by the marshal's presence, came forward with their own stories. A farmer who had been cheated in a land deal. A blacksmith who had seen Jedediah strike his horse in a fit of rage. These were the quiet resentments that had simmered beneath the surface of the town's feigned respect for a pillar of the community. The other faction, larger and more virulent, closed ranks, led by the pious Martha Miller. They saw the investigation not as a search for truth, but as an attack on the town's moral fabric, an assault orchestrated by a fallen woman and her gunslinger paramour. They spoke of Eleanor's coldness, her strangeness. They resurrected the old, poisonous whispers, polishing them until they shone with righteous indignation. To them, Eleanor's guilt was a settled fact, a cornerstone of their worldview, and to have it questioned was to have their own judgment, their own very identities, called into question. Marshal Thompson listened to it all with the same impassive expression. He re-interviewed Reverend Michael, who stammered and spoke of Christian forgiveness for all parties. He visited the retired Sheriff Amos Blackwood, who, with the weight of federal authority in his dusty parlor, finally unburdened his conscience, telling the marshal everything he had told Silas about the cut cinch and the bruises on Jedediah's body. The fulcrum of the investigation was Jedediah's journal. Eleanor presented it to the marshal not with triumph, but with a quiet, somber dignity. Thompson read it in the cabin, with Silas standing watch by the door and Eleanor sitting at the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He read of the debts, the affair, the casual cruelty, and the final, damning entry about the horse he had won from Calloway. When he was finished, Thompson closed the book gently. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment, his gaze no longer disinterested, but filled with a kind of weary respect. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice softer than Silas had yet heard it. "You've carried a heavy burden for a long time." The final hearing was held in the church, the only building in town large enough to hold the simmering animosity of the entire population. The room was divided, the two factions sitting on opposite sides of the aisle, as if for a wedding between two warring families. Eleanor and Silas sat in the front pew, a small island in a sea of hostility and reluctant support. Marshal Thompson stood at the pulpit and laid out the facts in a calm, methodical voice, stripping the story of all its rumor and emotion. He spoke of Jedediah's debts. He spoke of his confirmed affair. He read the former sheriff's testimony regarding the suspicious circumstances of the death. He read Jedediah's own words from the journal, his cavalier attitude toward a horse known to be a killer. "The conclusion of this investigation," Thompson stated, his voice ringing with finality in the silent church, "is that Jedediah Hayes was a man engaged in numerous dishonest and disreputable activities. His death was most likely a direct result of his own reckless behavior, or possibly an act of retribution by persons he had wronged, specifically the man known as Calloway, whose present whereabouts are unknown. What is certain is that there is not, nor was there ever, a single shred of evidence to suggest the involvement of his wife, Eleanor Hayes." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the stunned faces of Martha Miller and her followers. On behalf of the territorial authorities, he continued, looking directly at Eleanor, I wish to offer a formal and public apology to Mrs. Hayes for the cloud of suspicion she has been forced to live under. This case is officially closed. A wave of murmurs rippled through the church. Eleanor did not weep or smile. She simply sat there, her back straight, and gave a single, dignified nod. For her, it was not a victory, merely the end of a long and unjust war. The truth had not set her free, it had only, finally, been spoken aloud. But the truth did not bring peace. For those who had built their identities on the foundation of Eleanor's guilt, the marshal's declaration was not an exoneration, but a deep and personal humiliation. Their righteous anger, now robbed of its target, curdled into something uglier and more desperate. It sought a new home, and it found one in Silas. He was the outsider, the catalyst, the man who had brought this unwelcome truth upon them all. The attack came that evening. The marshal and his deputy had retired to the boarding house, rebuilt just enough to be functional, and a false sense of security had settled over the cabin. Silas had gone into town to procure some supplies for their inevitable departure, leaving Eleanor to pack the few belongings she intended to keep. He was walking back from the store, a sack of provisions over his shoulder, when they came at him from the narrow, dark alley between the saloon and the blacksmith's shop. There were 3 of them, their faces contorted with whiskey and rage. He recognized them as cronies of Jedediah, men who had lost the most in status and pride with their friend's posthumous disgrace. "Should have left our town alone. Cain," one of them slurred, blocking his path. Silas dropped the sack, his hand moving toward his gun, but he was too slow, his mind still on Eleanor and the road ahead, not on the immediate danger. A second man swung a heavy piece of firewood, catching him across the back of the knees. His legs buckled, and he went down. The third man kicked his gun away as it slipped from its holster. It wasn't a fight, it was a beating. They kicked and punched with a vicious, cowardly fury, their grunts and curses filling the cold night air. Silas fought back, a primal rage giving him strength. He landed a solid blow that broke one man's nose, but they were too many. He felt a boot connect with his ribs, stealing his breath. A fist slammed into the half-healed wound on his temple, and the world dissolved into a dizzying array of stars. He was vaguely aware of a sharp, piercing pain in his side, a coldness that was somehow also a burning. And then the world faded to black. He was found minutes later by Belle, who had heard the commotion and come out with a shotgun in her hands. The men had already scattered. Silas lay crumpled in the dirt, unconscious, a dark, spreading stain on his shirt just below his ribs. When they carried him back to the cabin, Eleanor met them at the door. She saw the blood, the bruised and battered face of the man she loved, and a sound escaped her throat that was not human. It was the raw, guttural cry of a soul being torn in two. She worked with a frantic, terrifying calm, directing Belle to boil water as she cut away his shirt. The knife wound was deep, a vicious stab that had missed his vitals by a mere inch. For the second time, she found herself cleaning his blood, but this time the fear was a cold, suffocating blanket. This time, she knew with a sickening certainty how close she had come to losing him forever. Belle eventually left, leaving them alone in the lamplit silence of the cabin. Silas was conscious now, his breath shallow, his face a mask of pain. Eleanor knelt beside his makeshift bed on the floor, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. The strength that had carried her through 2 years of solitude, through the town's scorn and the marshal's investigation, had crumbled to dust. She was hollowed out, filled only with a terror so vast it threatened to consume her. She looked at his still form, at the stark reality of his mortality, and a truth rose up in her, a truth more powerful than any she had ever known. "If you had died," she whispered, her voice breaking, the words raw and elemental. "If they had killed you, Silas, I would never have forgiven myself. It was the ultimate confession. It was the admission that her life was no longer her own, that her heart was now inextricably bound to his. It was the final, complete surrender of a woman who had sworn never to need anyone again. He reached out a hand, his movements weak, and cupped her cheek. He couldn't speak, but his eyes told her everything she needed to know. They left 2 days later. Silas was weak, his side tightly bandaged, but he was resolute. He could not stay, and he would not leave her behind. The marshal provided them with an escort for the first 10 miles, a clear warning to the rest of the town. They rode out at dusk. After the final hearing where several men, their faces bruised and sullen, were fined for public brawling, no one confessed to the knifing. It didn't matter. Justice was not to be found in Redemption Gap. As they cleared the last of the town's wretched buildings, they didn't look back. They rode side by side, Eleanor's hand reaching out to take his, their fingers intertwined. A firm, unbreakable grip. They crested a low hill and paused, looking west. The setting sun had ripped the sky open, pouring out a violent, magnificent flood of crimson and gold. The snow on the distant peaks was stained the color of rust. It was a beautiful, brutal sunset, a sky that looked like it was bleeding. It was the end of a chapter written in pain, and a fitting, bloody farewell to the life they were leaving behind. They turned their horses and rode on, into the gathering dark, their faces set toward a future they would have to build for themselves. The months that followed were a quiet alchemy, transforming the raw, wounded elements of their past into the sturdy substance of a new life. They traveled south, putting hundreds of miles between themselves and the bitter memory of Wyoming, finally settling in a small, sun-drenched valley in the Colorado Territory. The land was gentle here. Cupped between rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine, they bought a small, neglected homestead with a cabin that needed work, a barn that leaned with the wind, and a stretch of pasture that ran down to a creek that chuckled over smooth stones. This new world was built not with words, but with the steady rhythm of shared work. The past was a ghost they had outrun, and they did not speak its name. There was no need. The story of Redemption Gap was written in the faint white scar above Silas's temple and the network of finer, invisible scars around Eleanor's heart. They did not need to revisit the wound. They were too busy building the life that grew from it. Silas, a man who had only ever known how to break horses and hearts, discovered a new kind of patience. He worked with a small herd of wild mustangs that came with the land. His movements slow and sure, his voice a low, steady murmur. He was no longer breaking them, but gentling them, earning their trust with a quiet respect that he had never afforded man or beast before. The horses, once skittish and wild-eyed, learned to come to his call, their trust a mirror of his own transformation. Eleanor, in turn, turned her hands to the earth. The small patch of neglected ground beside the cabin became her sanctuary. Where there had been only dry soil and weeds, a garden began to flourish under her patient care. She planted vegetables for their table and herbs for healing. And at the edge, closest to the porch, she planted climbing roses, their thorny vines a testament to a beauty that was fierce and protective. In the act of coaxing life from the stubborn ground, she was coaxing it back into herself. The ghosts of Jedediah and the town's scorn faded with every new green shoot that pushed its way toward the sun. Their life together found its cadence in the simple, profound moments. The shared silence over coffee as they watched the sunrise paint the valley in hues of rose and gold. The easy smiles they exchanged when he came in from the barn, smelling of hay and horse, and she met him at the door with a fresh pail of water. The way her hand would find his as they sat on the porch in the evenings. Watching the last of the light fade behind the hills, they were healing, not by forgetting the storm, but by learning to live in the quiet sunshine that came after. Autumn bled into winter, and the nights grew long and cold once more. The wind that swept down from the mountains was a different wind here, a clean, sharp wind that spoke of snow and stillness, not of malice and isolation. One evening, after a long day of mending fences and preserving the last of the garden's bounty, a deep chill settled into the bones of the valley. They sat before the hearth, where a strong, steady fire of seasoned pine crackled and danced, filling the small cabin with a warm, golden light. The space was no longer a cage or a temporary shelter, but a home, filled with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs, and the profound, unshakable peace of a sanctuary earned. The old, heavy wool blanket, the one they had brought with them from that other life, the one that had been their first, desperate raft in a sea of cold and fear, lay across both their laps. It was a relic, a silent testament to the journey they had taken. Silas watched her face in the firelight. The haunted, weary lines he had first seen in Redemption Gap had softened. Her eyes, once the color of a winter storm, now held the warm, steady glow of the embers in the hearth. He saw the woman she was always meant to be, not broken, but forged. The love he felt for her was a quiet, powerful thing, a bedrock beneath his entire existence. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the blanket. She looked up from the flames, her gaze meeting his, and in her eyes, he saw his own love reflected. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and rough, "if you could go back to that first night, in the blizzard, if you could choose all over again, knowing everything that would happen, would you still choose me?" The question was not born of insecurity, but of wonder. It was the humble, awestruck question of a man who still couldn't quite believe his own good fortune, a man who had stumbled out of the darkness and into a grace he knew he didn't deserve. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, shimmering in the firelight like liquid gold. They were not the tears of sorrow he had seen before, nor the tears of terror. They were tears of a deep, overflowing gratitude, of a joy so profound it was almost painful. A single tear escaped and traced a slow, silver path down her cheek. She smiled, a small, tremulous smile that held all the beauty of a sunrise after a long night. She squeezed his hand, her grip firm and sure. "This time," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This time, I would not choose slowly." Her words were an absolution. They were the closing of the final door on the past and the unlocking of a future she had never dared to dream of. He pulled her to him, and she came willingly, melting into his embrace. They held each other, not with the desperate, grasping need of that first night, nor with the tentative, hopeful trust of their night on the snowfield. This was a different embrace altogether. It was slow and gentle, an embrace of quiet knowing, of complete and utter belonging. It was deep and warm and strong, the embrace of two people who had found in each other not a refuge from the world, but the world itself. He kissed her, and it was a kiss that held the memory of every hardship and the promise of every dawn to come. The golden light of the fire washed over them, bathing them in its warm glow, catching in the soft strands of her hair. They had not found a life without scars. The past was a part of them, a story etched into their very bones, but they had learned that scars were not just a sign of being wounded. They were a sign of having survived. Their love, born in the heart of a merciless winter, had not been a fragile thing that needed protecting from the world. It was a wild, resilient thing, a love that had survived the storm and learned to put down roots in the hard, unforgiving ground of the truth. It was a love that had, against all odds, endured. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you so much for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So drop a comment down below and say hello. If you enjoyed the tale, please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire for more stories from the Old West. Share your thoughts. We read every one,